Hello, fellow writers. It's me, AJS Creator here, back with a new episode. So we're going to be talking about the first and last of your writing. So let's start with, how do you start your book, okay? So, well, the simple answer to that question is start with what you know. So whatever you know about your book, that's what you're going to start with, whether that's the character, whether that's a plot line, whether that's, a theme, whatever you have in your head right now. If it's a scene, if it's a person, if it's a character, write out everything that you know. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be in order. Just write whatever inspired you to be like, oh, I want this as a book. So write what you know, get it all out there. The next thing you need to consider is a theme, because the theme is the why, it's why your reader should read your book, why your reader wants to read your book. You need to have a theme or a concept in mind. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a so what kind of book. So like someone will read your thing and be like, okay, well, so what? What? Like, why did I read this? This doesn't have a theme. This doesn't have a moral or a meaning. It's just, a bunch of stuff happening. So you want to integrate your theme. You want to have that everything ready and pulled up so you have everything that you know out of your head onto paper. And then you move on to the next step, which is start writing until it feels natural. A lot of times it's so hard to get your writing out there because, you don't know what to write. You don't know where to start. So you just start writing. Just write until, you get in the zone and it feels really natural and it feels right to you. And don't care about it until it's already done. A lot of people get stuck on this step. You just write everything. Just put it out there. Just throw it up, okay? And then, it's going to be crap. It's going to suck, but that's fine. Don't care about it. Just keep writing. Don't even try to revise it, because a lot of people will get stuck revising and then be like, oh, I don't like this, so they'll rewrite it, and then they'll revise it, and then they're stuck on this one little tiny part that they never get the rest of the story done. So you don't want to worry about that. You just want to get it out there, get it done. After that happens, then you can start rewriting and revisiting and revising and caring about your story. Another way to start is by plotting world building and character profiles, a lot of which I will create a Word document for and post them in a link below. I haven't gotten that far yet because I'm still building these profiles, but eventually, I'll update this video and maybe even make a new one with all those profiles available to you. So yeah, so after you put what you know, maybe you want to plot a little bit or a lot, whatever you feel comfortable with. And remember, always remember, you can't fix something that isn't there. If you don't write it, you can't fix it. So just keep that in mind. Okay, again, I put why should I or the reader care. Again, this is the why, the theme, the so what. And these are things that an author needs to be, considerate of. Of course, you don't have to be considerate of the first draft, but maybe if the first draft is lacking this answer to the question, I should say, then you need to care. So think about what the theme is and why the reader should be reading your book. You might even want to consider your audience. Think about your audience and what your audience would like to see in the book and why they would be your target audience. Because obviously, if you have a target audience, you're going to want to fulfill that need for that audience, okay? Not everybody is going to be happy with your book, and that's fine. But your target audience should be relatively happy, and they should get something from your book. Because obviously, think about why you're putting your book out there in the first place. If you're putting your book out there just to put it out there, then you're not going to get too much out of it. You want to put, a lot of readers just want to read good books, and some readers want to read a book with a purpose. But as a writer, think about what your audience wants, think about what kind of readers you want, and try to get that integrated into your book. You also want to think, as an author, why am I publishing this? Am I publishing it for self-gratification, or am I publishing this because I actually want people to be reading this? If you want people to be reading this, then you need to consider the people reading it. You don't want your readers to be bored reading your book either, so if you have a mystery book full of suspense and stuff, you're not going to target it towards fantasy like romance readers, and maybe they fall into both categories, but usually, you know, mystery suspense readers are going to read mystery suspense books, and romance fantasy people are going to read romance fantasy books. You know, and maybe there's a variety of readers who like to read a variety of books, but overall, some people have a favorite genre, and that's what they're going to read in that genre. So, you know, don't think about your target audience, think about what they want, and target your book towards them. And then also, again, with not boring your readers, you want to make sure that your book is, you know, fun, action-packed, enjoyable. And one way to do that is to consider your audience and think about what they want. And then another way to do that is think about the book you want to read and the book you want to write. And that's how you're going to get there. So if it's boring to you to write, it's going to be boring for your readers to read. So that's another thing to consider, is keeping everything eventful so that your readers and you as the writer don't get bored, okay? You want to also let your readers, you know, you don't want to let your readers put down the book. That is a failure as an author. I know a lot of readers who are just like, just one more page, or, oh no, I can't, you know, I gotta read the next chapter, I gotta know what happens. And that's the kind of book that you want. You don't want your readers to put down your book. You want your readers to stay up till 3 a.m. to finish the book and then get mad that they don't have the next book on hand, so they're gonna drive to the store the next morning and buy the next book and then read it all day. That's the kind of person you want to be. That's the kind of book you want to write. You want to write a book that keeps the page turning. So consider that when you are ending your book, and how you're ending your book. And then not even just how you're going to end your book, but how you're going to end your chapters, your pages. Are your pages going to leave off mid-sentence so they have to turn the next page to know what the other person's saying? These are a lot of things to consider even before you get started, is how you're going to keep your reader turning the page. And now you really want to think about what you want your first to achieve. And what I mean by that is your first are your most important parts of your novel or your book or whatever you're trying to present that you have written. Whether that's the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first page, or the first chapter. Those are going to be the 4 most important things in that particular order. Because if your first chapter doesn't hook your reader, they may drop your book. If your first paragraph doesn't keep your reader reading, they may drop your book. If your first page doesn't look great, they may drop your book. And if your first chapter doesn't fulfill the needs of a first chapter, then your reader will drop your book and may not even come back to it, okay? So those are always the 4 things that people look at right off the bat, whether they do it consciously or not. What I mean by that is some readers do it unconsciously, and some people do it consciously, and then also a lot of publishers will be looking for those 4 first. And if they don't check off the first sentence, they may drop it. And so, you know, it's the most important part of your book, and I can't stress this enough. And there's a couple things that your firsts have to do. If you want to be a successful writer, you need to make sure that your firsts are checking off the boxes, okay? So the first sentence should hook your reader right off the bat. It should introduce some form of the story, whether that be introducing a character or the setting or the situation. Okay, your first sentence should immediately hook your reader, grab them in, and pull them into the story right away. That's what your first sentence should do. Your first paragraph should absolutely introduce the character, setting, or situation. It has to introduce one of those 3 things in order to keep them reading, okay? The main character within the first page, if not by the first paragraph, if you can't introduce them in the first paragraph, maybe you're setting up the scene or the situation, that's fine on the first paragraph. But by the end of the first page, the reader has to know who the main character is, what's their goal, and their voice. Just flat out, almost every first page does this. They give the character a distinct voice, they give the character a goal, and they give the character to the readers and say, hey, this is who they are, this is how they sound, and this is what they want. Those 3 things are going to be the most important about your first page. And by the end of your first chapter, you need to make sure that your readers care enough about that character to keep reading on to the next chapter. Okay? Your first chapter should also set up the mood, the tone of the story, how the story is going to play out, maybe how it's going to sound. It gives expectations that you need to meet for the reader. Okay? You're going to set up a theme. You're going to be like, this is going to be kind of what my story's about. You're going to build a setting. You're going to be like, this is where the story's taking place. If possible, you may even introduce the antagonist. Sometimes this doesn't happen till later chapters, but it should definitely happen at the start of your story. Okay? You also want to create conflict. Right off the bat, conflict should be happening in your first chapter. I don't care what that conflict is, but it needs to happen. It doesn't even have to be the main conflict. It can be just a minor conflict, but the bigger the conflict, the more tension that you can build within the first chapter, the better your story is going to be. Remember, this is the first thing that your readers will read, and it's the first thing that publishers will read. If you cannot catch your publisher on that first hook, that first line, they may not even bother to read the first paragraph. If you manage to catch them and they read that first paragraph and that doesn't fulfill some of the needs that they need, they'll drop it. You have to remember that a lot of times when you submit to a publisher, they have a massive, massive pile called the slush pile. It's just thousands and thousands and thousands of submissions. So the editors of that publication aren't even reading those. They're probably interns or people trying to get into the things, or newly graduates, or, people who are working under them that are going through these slush piles. And they have a lot to read. So they're going to read it fast and efficiently. So if you can't manage to catch them within the first sentence, first paragraph, or first page, your book is out. And it's a hard truth. It's really rough to hear that. But a lot of times, that's what they have to do because they have so many submissions. They can't read everything. They simply don't have the time. If you manage to hook them to read the entire thing, they may send it on to the next step. And in that next step, if that person manages to read that whole section, they may email you and be like, hey, can you send us more of this manuscript? And then from there, you may or may not have a chance. But that first step, that first getting through that slush pile is going to be the most important thing, because the first things, your first sentence, your first paragraph, your first page, and your first chapter are going to be what determines whether you move on or not. And maybe you don't have to go through that whole process. Maybe you're self-publishing, and that's great for you. But for everybody else who wants to go through the traditional publication system, I need to stress how important your firsts are. And let's say you do self-publish, you still have the issue of going through those steps with your reader. Because if nobody's reading your book, why are you publishing it, okay? So, yeah, think about how you're going to achieve these checkboxes in your first chapter. And think about what you need to do in your first page. You need to hook the reader, introduce the character, introduce their voice, and introduce their goal. I'm going to give you a quick example before I move on to the next slide. Let's say Philip is going to go take a math test, okay? And Phil is, kind of bubbly, sarcastic, and he's super stressed about this math test because if he fails the class. And then he's super anxious because he's like, if I fail this class, then I don't get to go into college because I don't have a good grade, and then I don't get to graduate college, and then I'll become a failure, and I'll have to work at McDonald's for the rest of my life, and he talks very fast, and he's very anxious about this test. But during the test, so I know right away, Phil is an anxious teenager who's worried about his future. I know that he wants to pass his math test. And maybe I want to read to see if he passes this math test or not. This is my first paragraph. Well, in the second paragraph, he's in his math test. He's taking it. He's super stressed because he's like, I know some of these questions, some of these I don't know. And all of a sudden, a violent shaking happens. And this loud rumbling is ringing. And all these kids are now dodging under his desks. And now there's an earthquake. Well, within my two first paragraphs, I managed to introduce the setting. The school, they're in school. I introduced the main character in the goal. Philip just wants to pass a math test. oh no, but that goal has changed now, which is okay. It's okay, because now the goal has changed to something bigger. I've given us conflict. They're in the middle of an earthquake. I've set up the mood and the tone for the story. The story is kind of funny, quirky, anxious, but also serious and tense. Okay? It's going to be action-packed, but also funny. And I've made you care enough about this reader to keep you reading, hopefully, because you're like, oh, I'll fill up anxious kid who wants to pass a math test. Been there, done that. But now he's in an earthquake, so now I'm caring about this character already, but now he's in a much harsher situation than he initially was. All that within 2 paragraphs. And by the end of that first page, I should hopefully have checked off all these boxes enough to keep people reading. I've also introduced an antagonist. Nature, is the antagonist in that first conflict scenario of trying to survive an earthquake. A very severe one at that. And yeah, so now we can go on with the story and build more tension. And that is what you want. And it doesn't always have to be something that extreme, but, just make sure you're checking off all your boxes. Hi, so now that we have, checked off the boxes for what you need in your first story, let's talk about ways to start your story. Because all stories start with one of 3 things: the wizard, the realization, the meeting, or the token. And the meeting and the token tend to be relatively the same thing. For the wizard, it's someone who comes and takes the main character away from their mundane life. Think about Harry living under the stairs with his neglectful, abusive aunt and uncle and Dumfrey. And all of a sudden, Hagrid comes in and is like, "You're a wizard, Harry," and he whisks them away to Hogwarts. That would be an example of the wizard. The realization. This one is maybe someone or something has come to the main character's door, and the main character decides he has no choice. He has to go on this journey. Otherwise, something may happen. I like to think about the Ugly series, where the main character's friend Shay runs away, and she has to go after Shay if she wants to become a pretty. Alright, so, she has no choice in order to achieve her goal, she has to go hunt down her friend who has run away. You may also even consider the Hunger Games. Katniss really has no choice but to volunteer and go on this journey to go into the Hunger Games because, her little sister's name was drawn and now it's either her or her sister. The third one is the meeting, or the token. The main character discovers something that will change their lives forever. For maybe Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, he discovers the One Ring, After Bilbo has gone, his thing is more of a wizard realization. And it can be, again, these things can be, you can have all 3, maybe 1 or 2 of them happen, and maybe they just build upon each other, but at least one of these, if not multiple of these, have to happen. So for Frodo, he discovers the One Ring, he discovers he has a realization, discovers he has to go destroy the One Ring, and he has the wizard who takes them away to help them, which is Gandalf. So in the case of Lord of the Rings, all 3 of these things happen. But, it doesn't always have to be one of those 3 things. Sometimes it's the meeting, okay? Or, the token. So in Spider-Man, when that Spider-Man gets bit by a spider and discovers he has superpowers, that would be the token, or the meeting that happens with that spider that gives him those powers. There are so many of these that happen that, build the story, and it's always one of these 3, if not multiples of these 3. A lot of reasons why is because these kind of create conflict, actions, and unusual events or mysteries. And that's another way to start your story, is by immediately having action or conflict. Or maybe an unusual event or a mystery happen. Like maybe they're at a mansion and there's been a murder and they have to solve the murder. That's a mystery that immediately happens. An unusual event, maybe it's something like a birthday party or an anniversary or marriage or a parade, something happening, an event, and something unusual happens during that event. Make sure that when you're starting, you're describing the emotional landscape, not only the physical landscape, but also the emotional one. You want to build tension and tone in your story. And a lot of times that can be done either through your characters or the way you're wording things, through your diction and your dialogue, and even your monologue as well. You want to also start a plot, or at least establish some rules of the world, like how this world is going to work. You set up expectations for the reader as they're going to be reading this first page or this first paragraph or whatever it is. So now that we've talked about some ways to start your story, let's talk about some ways that you should not start your story. One of them is a sudden or forced action. So like, suddenly there was this, or if you do a once upon a time kind of a sequence, unless it's a fairy tale or fable, it's not really appropriate for the story. Or it was a dark and dreary night where you go super in-depth scene description. And I know a lot of people really want to set up the scene and they do a lot of description for it, but that kind of takes, the excitement out of your story. So you don't want to start your story that way with lots and lots of description or really forced action. That doesn't feel natural. Like I said before in the previous slide, there are certain ways that you can and you want to start your stories. That's just not one of them that works very often. Of course, all of these you can do, but they're just not the best way to start your story, and a lot of them are executed very poorly because of that. Another way to start is lots of dialogue. If you back and forth dialogue is fine, but then you want to add in some description and you want to add in some character development and some introductions into your story and the theme. But if you just have lots and lots of dialogue, you have the same issue with lots of description. It just doesn't work. The next one is addressing the reader directly or telling them if the story is true or not. So, like the narrator, this is a true story about a dog, and like they go in depth about it. So you don't want to do that. It kind of takes the reader out of the story, and you don't want that. You want your reader to be sucked into the story. You want your reader to be a part of the story. A lot of people who address the reader directly kind of break the fourth wall, and that can also go very badly, very quick, especially at the start of the story. There are a few people who do it very well. Lemony Snicket is one of them with his series of unfortunate events, where the narrator is telling the story about these kids and he's telling them to you, the reader, and so he executes it very well. So that is an example of it being done great, but he doesn't start the stories addressing the reader right away and telling them whether it's true or not. He does that a little bit later on. He leads you into the story before dropping you into it, and by then you're already committed as the reader, and so you don't really get pulled out of the story because the narrator is involving you as a character. So you're the audience and the narrator is addressing you as the audience. So that's one way of it doing really great. A lot of the times though, it doesn't do too hot, because I know if you've ever, especially this one is used a lot in horror stories. And that kind of takes the mystery out of it, is telling them, oh, this is a true story or not. Another example of this happening is in Megamind, and I think they do it okay. I think there are a lot of ways they could have started the story and just avoided this sequence altogether, but in Megamind, the movie starts with, here's my day so far. Went to jail, lost the girl in my dreams, and got my butt kicked pretty good. Well, things could be a lot worse. Oh, that's right, I'm falling to my death. Guess they can't. And so, it starts off with this character telling you their story really fast, and then it's like, well, let me start at the beginning, and it goes way back to when he was an infant, right? And so it doesn't do it great, but it doesn't do it bad. So it still works. I just think they could have started that movie a lot better. And don't get me wrong, Megamind is one of my favorite movies of all time. So I can quote it forwards and backwards almost perfectly and effortlessly. But yeah. You can also think about all the horror stories. Again, like I said, this is a popular starter for horror stories where it's like, this is a true story about blah, 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 blah. And it just doesn't work as great as you would like it to. The fourth one is running in the forest, or the troublemaker starter. This one is, the reason why you shouldn't use it is not because it's a bad opening, but because it's very cliche. It's often used way, 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 way too much. Someone's running away from somebody in the forest and you don't know what they're running after. I think of Criminal Minds a lot, and I mean a lot of episodes. I know this for a fact because I'm watching Criminal Minds a lot right now. It starts with somebody running in the woods or running away from the person who's trying to kill them, or screaming and running, and it's used a lot, and not only in TV series, but also movies and books. It's just not the best way to start. Yes, you want to jump right into the action, but that's not one way to do it. Like I said in the last slide, you want to start it, you want to introduce it, and then get into the action. That's the best way to go, is, make sure your readers are comfortable with where you're at. They know the main character, the tone, and the setting before you kind of just hit them, like literally slap them across the face, be like, boom, action. So when you start with that, your readers are just kind of like, whoa, okay, let's see where we're going with this. And it's not necessarily a great thing to do. It's not really a bad thing to do. So just keep in mind that it's a cliche. That's really why it's on this list. It's not a great, but not a bad way. This one, however, the next one, the describing the character right away, where it's like, oh, Amy looked into the mirror and saw her ivy bluish green eyes and her pale lips, and she was like, oh no, look at my acne's breaking out. Yeah, no, we don't do that. We don't do that here. It's super cliche. It's very tacky. It never works out. You don't need to have a character looking in a mirror to describe them. There are so many different ways to do it. And you don't want to just basically scream in your reader's face what your character looks like. You just kind of sprinkle it in throughout the story. Either she's playing with her hair, or it's tangled, or she's combing it, and then you maybe someone else is looking at her, or maybe she's seeing her reflection somewhere else. How they see themselves and how other people see them as well are going to be vastly different. So you can play around with it if you have different points of views and stuff like that. So you got to consider, how is the reader going to perceive this character based on the description. If you start with a mirror, you're going to get a Mary Sue pick-me type girl, and you don't want that. Never do this one. It's a cliche. It's very bad. Don't do it. Avoid it at all costs. I'm not saying you can't have your character looking at a reflection and describing themselves. Just don't do it in the first chapter, and don't do it too in depth, and make sure that you can sprinkle it still before this happens. This one is a heavy one. The world building, backstory, flashbacks, exposition, whatever. This is just a hard one for me, because a lot, and I mean a lot, of beginning writers do this one, and they just don't know that you shouldn't, because I don't care. That's where your reader's at, is the, okay, well, I don't care. All this stuff, all the world building, backstory, the flashbacks and exposition, all that, I should not have screaming in my face right when I read the story. It should be sprinkled throughout the story. It should be scattered here and there. Yes, you can have all these elements in your story, just not at the beginning. And I know you're like, oh, well, I want my reader to know the world that I've built and created, and they will. You just can't give it all to them at once. It rarely, if ever, turns out well. Like, I can't think of someone who's done it and done it well right now, but I'm sure somebody has done it and done it well. But a lot of times it's just not the best way to start your story. Speaking of the flashback part, that kind of ties in with the dream sequence or the waking up as well, as a very cliche, very bad beginning. And a lot of times, again, I'm going to go back to the publisher. If a publisher reads that, they will immediately throw it out, because it's gypping your reader of something. You can have a dream sequence or waking up sequence or flashbacks or backstory or literally anything, almost anywhere else in your story, just not the beginning. Leave it till, I don't know, you need at least 5 chapters before you start doing your dream sequence or a waking up sequence or a vision sequence, or like flashbacks. Maybe the first, you gotta give it at least 3 chapters to build your story and your characters before you start giving flashback and exposition. But overall, it should be sprinkled throughout your story, and it should wait. That's not your priority right now, is not letting them know the story, it's letting them know the setup. Okay? So for this slide, I'm just going to go over it real quick because a lot of the information here is kind of rephrasing and reiterating what we said in the last slide. So these are the things you need to watch out for as you're building up your first. The first thing you need to do is exposition. Again, it goes to that dream sequence or that waking up sequence or that like backstory sequence. A lot of it, exposition all at once, especially in the beginning, is not good for your story. So just sprinkle it out throughout your story and avoid it for the beginning for now, because they don't need to know everything all at once. And actually, it's better if you have your exposition later in the story, because that way they can slowly kind of solve the backstory and get used to the characters before the backstory happens. The next thing is prologue and epilogues. Prologues always happen before the story takes place, and they are either done really well or they're really poor, and there's usually no in between. There's not a lot of prologues that I can think of that have like really wowed me and stuck with me. A lot of the times, though, the prologues that do stick with me are the ones that I read them, they don't make sense. I read the story, I go back and I read the prologue, and it clicks, and I'm like, oh, that's what that was about. Either that, or I'll read the entire story and then I'll remember that the prologue and be like, oh, so that's what the prologue was. The prologues usually the ones that stick don't make sense when you first read them, but once you finish the book, then the prologue makes sense. And those are done very skillfully and very well, and Brandon Sanderson does that amazingly, I think. Epilogues are very generic sense of epilogues are not as great. The way I think of a generic epilogue is you're watching a film or documentary based on a true story, and then as the credits are rolling, it's got like a picture of somebody, and it's like, this is Bob, he went on to make his own restaurant, and this is Glenn, and he went on to be a successful store owner and got promoted to manager or whatever. It's just like those generic kind of, oh, this is who they are, this is what happened after this story. So that's the generic sense of epilogues, and epilogues tend to get a bad rap because of that. If your story has a series, epilogues usually don't happen till the last book of the series as well. So those are just some things to watch out for and be considerate of whether you want them in your story or not, and how they are going to affect your story. Another thing you need to watch out for is not overwhelming your character. This goes back to the exposition, too much descriptions, too many characters. All these things can just overwhelm your readers. Too much action, too many things to keep track of, all of that. You as a writer may even be overwhelmed trying to keep track of it if you're writing it. If you are overwhelmed writing it and trying to keep track of everything, then your readers are going to have a way harder time than you, because you know your story, you know your characters, your readers do not. At least not yet. So just keep track of that kind of thing. Like if you, especially the too many characters, I've had people like, oh, this is my friend group. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Like, and they'll introduce like 10 characters all at once. And I'm like, wait, who was the one with blonde hair and who was the brunette with freckles? Like what? Who was who? And you get confused. One way to avoid this is the rule of thumb with characters is you should have no more than 3 characters introduced in a chapter. So in the first chapter, you have your main character, and then maybe the second most important character can be introduced, or you can introduce a couple side characters. But overall, these characters shouldn't matter too much, except for the main character in the first chapter. Then in the second chapter or third chapter or whatever chapter after that, that's when you can introduce more characters, and you introduce them 2 to 3 at a time. You never want to go over that number, otherwise you may overwhelm your characters. Later in the story, though, you can have lots of characters all at once, and since you introduce them slowly and gave your reader time to adjust and know them, then they can understand, oh yeah, this is this character, and this is characters from this chapter, and this one's from this chapter, and that's how and now they're finally meeting again. So that's one way to consider it. So that one is one that a lot of readers kind of struggle with, and a lot of writers just go for and then realize that it's not going to work out. So just avoid starting out with way too many characters. Start with your main character and maybe the main character's best friend or sidekick or the wizard that comes to whisk them away or whatever. Just focus on 1 to 2 characters, the main character and another one in the first chapter. You may even want to start with your antagonist and your main character interacting in the first chapter, and that's totally fine as well. You don't want to start with a summary rather than a scene. This goes back to the cliche show, not tell kind of thing. So it's like, oh yeah, this happened, and she lost her mother, and then her father died in a car accident, and then she ended up in the orphanage for a couple years, and then she moved around to foster homes, and now this is where we're starting our story. That's, again, another big exposition. That's a big summary. No, we don't want that. Erase that. Take that out of your mind. Start with a scene. Give us a description. Set the mood. Describe your character a little bit. Then move into the action. That's what you want to do. You don't want to start with a big description of like the scene and everything happening and telling us what's happening or summarizing. You want to sprinkle it in and go with this flow and move with the story. The last thing is, don't start with fancy language. You can have fancy language, just leave it for later. Keep it simple and sweet for your first, okay? Another thing with fancy language is things like spells or jargon or whatever. So if they're like, oh yeah, I computed the codex and this and blah blah blah, and they're all doing technical lingo, and you're like, I'm lost. Your reader may just drop that right away. But if they know the character, they know that the character uses that technical lingo, they know the character is a hacker, they're like, yeah, whatever, I don't know what that means, but that character sure does. Another thing could be like spells, like I said earlier, like, I'm going to kill you, Harry Potter, I'm pointing my wand as hard as I can. And you're like, oh, he's using the spell of death against Harry Potter. And you know that lingo because it was built up, and you learned it with Harry. So all that fancy language, all those spells and stuff, you kind of learn as you read the books or watch the movies or whatever. So when you start with fancy language that the reader doesn't know, it's going to confuse them. One way that I got really confused is like, I was reading a book and they were using all this fancy language and all these terms that I didn't understand, and it was a magical world, and they were talking about like pushing and pulling and jumping, and like just a bunch of stuff was happening, a lot of action, and I was like, I have no idea what's going on. And as I continued to read the book, it started to click with me, but I wish I had read some of the stuff that clicked with me and I got to know the world more before they just threw me into it, because throwing me into the world is a great way to start the story, but also it left me very confused and unfamiliar with all the language they were using. And so rereading the story, it's great, but the first time I was very confused and very frustrated because I didn't know 100% what was going on. So that's why you shouldn't start with fancy language. You should build up to it. Make sure your reader is familiar with your world and your terms and technical terms before you even start to use language. Alrighty, so we've covered a lot of firsts. Let's talk about the last. Let's talk about how we're going to end our novel. Let's wrap up loose ends. Make sure that the ending is satisfied to the reader. You don't want your reader finishing your story and saying, that sucked. That was stupid. I hate that. Gross. Or your reader closing the book and going, what was the point? I read all that, and for what? One of the ways that your reader can get super frustrated is if you start with a dream sequence and end with one. One of the best ways I can think about this was my sister read the Twilight films, and I remember watching the last one with her after she had read the books and everything, and she said the books covered this great, but the movies did it so bad. and she was really frustrated with the books anyway, even though they were better than the movies. The last film is this big, huge battle, and a lot goes on, and a lot of things happen, and it's basically the bulk of the movie and the book. And then at the end, it was like Rosalie, I think, can show the future. She was showing the future to this guy, and she said, "That's what's going to happen if we do this. So we shouldn't fight." And my sister's like, "I feel like I've just been gypped, like, of this entire story because it was all just a dream or all just a vision." And it really robs a reader of the story, and it's very frustrating to have an ending like that. So it's not satisfying at all, and it's like, what's the point? Why did I read all that if it never even happened? So you don't want to end your story that way. It's not a great way to do it, and it's I haven't read a book that has done it good yet. You also want to make sure that you resolve all the issues if it's the end of the series. If it's not the end of the series, just make sure you resolve the main issue of that novel. Make sure that your characters are dynamic and round and well developed. They should change, and they shouldn't be the same characters we started with. They should be almost completely new people, because if your characters are static and they don't change throughout the story, then there's some issue with your story. They can still be the same character, but they should change. There's no way around it. After they go through an entire journey, they should be changed people. Don't leave your reader confused, but leave them thinking. So this one I love to play with because I love to leave my books open-ended. I like to wrap up all the bow ties and then just leave one little thing open so that my readers can be like, "Oh, but what if this happened at the end?" Or "What if this did it?" And then that's the kind of stuff that sparks fan fiction and fan art, and it sparks inspiration in other people, because yes, everything is wrapped up, but there's still just that tiny little spark of what if, or oh my goodness, like, I don't think what happens next, like, this is an open-ended thing even though everything's wrapped up. One of the things I can think about is The Giver, where The Giver ends is very ambiguous. It's a very ambiguous open-ended book, so it can leave the reader, guessing and thinking about what happens next and what happens in the future for the ending. So, think about that. Think about how you're going to leave them thinking, but wrap up all your ends so they're not confused. Then leave them with book hangover. And what I mean by this is they want more. Book hangover or movie hangover or whatever. Almost everybody I know has experienced this, where they have read a book, watched a movie, or finished a TV series, and that's it. That's the end. And they just, what am I going to do with my life? I just feel so incomplete now that this is finished. How am I going to start a new story after this? I just want to go back and reread it, and now it's over and there's no more. And they just don't know what to do because they're just hungover on that book, and they're just thinking about that series that they had just finished, that it was so good to them that they can't stop thinking about it. So yeah, kind of like one of the best, I think, is Avatar: The Last Airbender. It ended years ago, and yet people are still constantly talking about it because that's how good it was. They still remember it, they still go back and watch it, they're just never done with it, and they just continue to enjoy it long after the series has ended. So yeah, make sure you find a way to end your novel to keep them thinking and to keep them wanting more, even if it's all done. Leave them with book hangover, guys. So we talked about some ways to end your novel, so let's talk about some ways that you should not end your novel. You don't want to leave the reader feeling like so what, or like, oh my goodness, that was such a waste of time, like why did I even try to read this? The best example I can think of is the Twilight series. In the last book, I never read them, but my sister did, and I watched the movie with her. But in the last book and movie, they have this entire battle sequence. It's the bulk of the movie and apparently the book, and it's like super intense, and it's the climax. And then turns out it was all just a vision that Rosalie, who can see the future, showed to another character. So then the reader just feels gypped because it's like, so what? So like, you're telling me that everything that I went through and experienced in this whole climatic battle doesn't even matter because it was all just a dream. So you don't want to do that kind of stuff. Because it really leaves the reader frustrated. Another thing that leaves the reader frustrated is if you have like an open ending and you don't tie up loose ends and stuff. And it's fine to leave them frustrated and like wanting to read the next book if it's a series, but if it's the last one, you want to make sure you're wrapping up all those loose ends. And you never want to leave them with like flat characters. You always want well-rounded characters, dynamic characters that are going to change throughout the series. They're never the same from start to finish. If your characters are static, they better not be your main characters. And then while we're talking about main characters, don't kill them in a way that makes the reader frustrated and upset, because there are very few and far between books that can kill all the characters and you're fine with it. It's a very thin line and it's very hard to cross, so you need to tread it carefully. The one example that I can think of that can do it really well is Brandon Sanderson. He wrote the Mistborn series, Way of Kings, and a bunch of other books. But in one of his series, and he ends up killing all these characters, but he does it in a way that doesn't leave the reader upset. And it is well done and well executed, which is really hard to do because, one book I can think of that did it really bad was the Divergent series. Now, I never read them, but from what I hear, the last book, Allegiant, left a lot of the people who I talked to who had finished that book, they're like, I hated it. I hated the third book. They just killed everybody. It was horrible. So you don't want to leave your reader feeling like that. I also have this graphic right over there. It wraps up a lot of these endings very great. I'm just going to touch about them briefly. So you have your circular ending where it starts the way that it ends. One of the best ways I can talk about this is either, they wake up from a dream, the entire story, and then it ends, it was all just a dream. And that's a very frustrating circular ending. A better circular ending would be kind of a cycle. So like, somebody raised an abusive home and they become a serial killer, and then they abuse somebody else, and then the book ends with that person being like, I'm going to become a serial killer. So it's not the same character, but it's a big cycle that goes through, and you can see the pattern happening. So that's another way to execute the circular ending without making your reader frustrated. You also have your moral ending, where you're going to see the character's growth and see how far they've come, and it wraps everything nicely, and it's very based on morals and ethics, like, we should kill the ruler. The moral ending for me would be the last Hunger Games, because they try to overrule the Capitol, and it's a very moral ending to me. Then you have your surprise ending, where it's very shocking to me because this one happens all the time. The best way I can describe this one is like when you're reading a mystery and you're like, it was the butler. I know it's the butler. Oh my goodness, it's got to be the butler. And then at the last minute, they're like, it was the maid, and here's why. And you're like, I never even suspected her. I thought she had an alibi. And then you're like, it was the maid having an affair with the gardener, and they were both in on it. And you're like, gasp. So it's like this sudden twist that happens at the very end, and it's very surprising, but you have to do these ones very carefully so that it's satisfying to your reader. Because if you suddenly twist it and it doesn't make sense, you just end up with another frustrating ending. Another one is an emotional ending. This one leaves the reader feeling any kind of emotion. I feel like the humor ending is very similar, except the humor one is they're laughing, like, haha, what a funny ending. But the emotion one is the like, falling, no, not my baby. Or they're like, yes, they finally did it, they won, and you're cheering for them. So there's so many different ways to capture this. The emotional ending, and again, these endings can all be intertwined. You can have multiple of these in one. Like, let's say you have the emotional one, and the emotional one is like, gasp, and it's a cliffhanger, and you're like super surprised, and you have to read the next book because it just ended in such a shocking way. And And then you have the reflective ending where the character looks back at everything they've achieved and they're like, ah, yes. And then they kind of sit on it. And then lastly, you have the question ending, which is like, oh, what's going to happen next? You know, it's one of those endings that you just think, and it leaves you thinking, and it really points back to the reader, kind of what's happening, where's it going, and a lot of times this one I feel like goes with a moral ending as well, where it ends on a little bit like everything resolves nicely, but it's so open-ended that it leaves you thinking what will happen next, or what if, or like thinking about, you know, what would you do in that situation. And then, you know, you have your image and your dialogue, and you can use it either way. The image ending I picture of, and then they rode off into the sunset living happily ever after. And the dialogue ending is, yeah, the end, yay. But you know, they can always be different, and there usually always are. But that's just kind of a brief way of ways you can and can end your stories and ways you shouldn't end your stories. I just thought about this, but the circular ending, one of the best books that I have read with this ending is The Outsiders, where it starts with like, hey, I will have this assignment to write this essay, and then it kind of goes into the story, and then at the end of the book, you realize that that entire book was his essay. So, yeah, so those are some things to consider how you're going to end your story and what you want your readers to finish with, because you want to end it strong, and you want to end with them and a specific ending in mind will really help you as you're getting through your entire story. Speaking of thinking about your ending in mind, you want to think about what you want to achieve when you end your story. Like, how you're ending your story is going to change what you're achieving with that. Are you going to keep them reading with a second book, so you're going to end on a cliffhanger or an open-ended question? Are you going to ask, like, address the problem or theme about themselves or the characters and end with like a moral dilemma and a question that you can ask to your characters? No matter what you do or how you end your story, you want to end it with a mic drop. You don't want someone to be, close your book, put it on the shelf, and never talk about it again. You want them to be like, oh, I love this book, you got to read it, here you go, and give it to other people, you know, and recommend it to other people. And a good ending usually is what sticks in your mind the most. A lot of people remember, you know, beginnings and end and the middles, a little parts of the middles, but not all of it. But they almost always will remember the ending if it's a good ending. And so you want to make sure that your ending is a good one. So to wrap up this video, I know it's a bit of a longer one than my other videos, but these are just some things I want you to think about as you're writing your ending. Think, are all the loose ends tied up? If not, is it because I'm going to have a second book that I'm going to resolve these issues in? Or are they loose ends that I can leave loose to keep the readers thinking? Or are they all tied up nicely, and they give my reader satisfaction? That leads us to the next one. Are you satisfying your reader? Are you leaving your reader with like, so what? So why did I read this book? Think about what you want your reader to take away from your book. Is it a theme? Is it a certain emotion? Is it like, you know, something that pulls on their emotions so that they recommend it to other people because like, oh, this is so good. What do you want your readers to take away from whatever you've written? Think about that, because that is always going to be the so what of your book, and it's one of the most important parts. You want to start your story usually with an end in mind. It doesn't have to be a clear ending, but it can be a vague one. But that ending is going to be what sticks with your readers the most, so you want to think about these things. And then, do I touch on my theme at the end, or do I leave it open-ended, or do I just not touch on my theme at all, and I trust that my readers will remember what I'm doing and why? And then, what will I leave my readers with? Will I leave them with a good book or a bad book? Will I leave them thinking or frustrated or happy or crying or sad? Think about what emotions you want to leave your reader with, how you're going to keep that ending in your book stuck in their mind so that they'll want to keep coming back to it, rereading it, recommending it to other people, maybe even be their favorite book. So these are all some small things that you can think about as you're writing your ending or before you write your ending. And thanks for watching. Until next time, have fun and good luck writing.